Hey everyone, this is Mike Dunn.
And I'm Janine Dunn.
I'm Julie Cook.
I'm Matt Downey.
And you are listening to Rethinking EDU. Thanks so much for joining us. Amazing listener out there, wherever you're listening, whether it's on Apple Podcasts or Spotify or what have you. We really appreciate you listening as usual. And we are here in our mini series on equity and belonging. And we are chatting with our friend, Patti Hess. Patti, how are you doing tonight?
I'm doing well. Thank you for inviting me.
Yeah, we are super happy to have you here. Thanks for joining us. Co-hosts, how you all doing tonight? Matt, I hear there's a little struggle in the neighborhood busing situation in your hometown. That sounds like a bummer, but is everything going okay otherwise?
Yeah, that's just a big issue. You know, the bus driver shortage is sort of hitting home, so we got to figure it out and get the kids to school and home, which, you know, is just an extra thing to juggle in the morning. And this morning they were late, and so I was late to work, but it's all good.
Yeah. The bus driver shortage is like real talk out there. You know, there was just an article in the National Education Association's like blog or publication or what have you about bus drivers and substitute teacher shortages, which is really intense. And Julie and Janine, y'all experiencing any of that stuff at your school at all?
My own kids have, like, they've had substitute bus drivers like nearly every day. Like, it seems to keep rotating. So they keep on getting to school late, or I don't know. It's just, it's a little bit of a mess.
And substitute bus driver, that's got to be a tough job. I can't
Oh, yeah.
even imagine. Jeez, so we all giggle a little bit because we're like, never.
There you go. We should do an episode with bus drivers. That would be awesome.
No joke. Yeah. All right. Let's talk about that in the think tank. Remember, listeners, you can subscribe on patreon.com/rethinkingedu. Join our think tank. Listen to our behind the scenes conversation. But first, let's get into it with Patti. Patti, so you hail in the great state of Connecticut, and you are the director of pupil services. So if I'm understanding that position correctly, and the reason why we've included you on this episode is because you're working primarily with a special education population, or the population that we call typically special education. But your position is more of like a district office sort of position. Is that correct?
Yep, that's correct. I'm the Director of Pupil Services for a school system here in Connecticut. So I oversee special ed for the entire district. So all students with disabilities are really my responsibility.
My goodness, that sounds daunting. Seriously, what an incredible task, and what a wide range of students that you are probably dealing with. You know, I can imagine that you have everywhere from kids with Down syndrome or, you know, autism spectrum disorder or something like that, to kids with dyslexia or other sorts of students, and all those students you're sort of overseeing the ins and the outs for them?
We serve students from the age of 3 to 22. So it's all students, all eligibilities, and I have the students that are in district as well as the students that we have partnered with some out of district placements with. So I have 336 students that that fall under me, but you know, as we talk more about inclusion, it really is, we have 2,500 students, because those are all the students in the district.
Sure. And yeah, that's a great segue into why we've invited you to come join our pod. You know, the last two episodes we focused on equity, and then we focused on belonging in classrooms, and why those two issues in particular are super important, especially as our student populations become more diverse, as our students are looking to feel like they belong in their classrooms, and as things like funding and resources get sort of spread out inequitably amongst different schools. These issues around equity, belonging, and now we're going to talk with you about inclusion are really some of the most pressing issues facing education today, I would argue. And I want to kind of get our listeners a little bit of a sense of you first, Patti, before we get into talking about inclusion and why this term is so important. I want to know, how did you end up in this position of Director of People Services, and what interested in working with this specific student population?
So prior to becoming the director of people services, I was a principal in a K-8 school, and I was also an assistant principal in a primary school. But more importantly, I started my career in education nearly 30 or over 30 years ago now as a school social worker. And I will always say that I will always ever be a social worker, and that my priority has always been removing obstacles for students with disabilities. So that has been my focus. So no matter what job I had, I always had those students with disabilities, on my lens, in my radar. And so it was really a natural progression for me. So as I was, taking on more tasks in my schools and in my district, it just became very natural for me then to ultimately end up in this role in the, overseeing special education.
That's awesome. And thanks for that snapshot. And also, Patty, I know that we met at Northeastern, and I would love to know, like, what brought you to that space? Why did you decide to pursue additional education at Northeastern?
That's a good question. I it was just I'm just being a lifelong learner. I just always, wanted to earn a doctorate, and so that was, had been considering it for a while. Did wait until my youngest son went off to college himself because I didn't want to miss those end of high school activities for my child. So I waited, and then I had a colleague who had actually gone through the program that we had gone through Northeastern, and she spoke very highly of it. So I figured, okay, I would apply and see what happened, and I was thrilled that I did that, and I felt like it's a very valuable experience. I thought that for me, I felt like the people I met and the guidance and support that I received was very meaningful. So for me, it was a really good experience.
That's awesome. Yeah, I think, we had largely positive experiences too, and I'm glad to hear that yours was as well. Now, I want to pass the mic over to Janine here to really get us into the meat of this conversation. It sounds like you've got a terrific background for helping us understand a little bit more about inclusion and special education. Janine, you want to take it off from here?
Yeah, thanks. So I'm really thinking about this idea of inclusion and going back to like the word inclusion, kind of like how we kind of analyzed the word belonging in our last episode. But, when I think of inclusion and how I've gone into schools that say they're doing inclusion, but from my own perspective, I would say that's not, I don't see that as inclusion. I've gone into schools where they have a room down the hallway on the bottom floor in a corner that's labeled special ed, and they view that as being inclusion because kids with special needs are coming into their school to be educated, and then that counts as inclusion. And I'm just wondering, like, what is there a continuum for inclusion? Like, what do we really mean when we say, we're providing an inclusive learning environment? And what does that really look like in reality? So I'm wondering what your thoughts are, Patti.
Oh, yeah, you should have seen me shaking my head when you were saying all that, Janine.
I knew you would be.
So when you talk about inclusion, the informal benchmark, students with disabilities spending 80% of their time with their non-disabled peers. But for me, that's a an informal benchmark. It's not what inclusion is. So for me, inclusion is belonging, right? So it means creating an environment where all students feel that the school is theirs, where all students feel that the classroom teacher is their teacher. For me, inclusion feels it's responsive. It's about responding to the student in your classroom or your school. It's about providing the student what they need. It's about validating your student as a learner in your school community, which is their school community. And I would say also inclusion is about access. It's about providing the student with disabilities access to that same rigorous general education curriculum in a meaningful way for that student. So when you talk about, the special education room down the hallway, I would say the same thing. If you have students in a classroom and they're pulled off to the back table and they're not engaged with the teacher doing the gen ed curriculum because they're at the back table with, a paraprofessional or even a special education teacher, but they're not engaged in a meaningful way with what's going on with the rest of the kids in the rest of the classroom, and they're not included. They're taking space in that room, but they're not being included. So for me, inclusion is belonging, responsive, and access.
I love that. And I love that you mentioned how, the idea of, really when there's teachers, more than when teachers are co-teaching, I really think I look at it as a co-teaching situation, but I can see how, you might have a regular ed teacher there, but you also have a special ed teacher in the room. And, where the lines kind of overlap, that in our classrooms, we look at it as we're all students and we're all teachers, and that we all have a hand in helping these students, and that our students actually don't know who is a special education teacher. Every classroom, we all have special ed teachers in our classrooms, but they don't know who that designated person is, because we all take a turn with leading and supporting and working with kids. And I don't know, just my perspective, I think that's how it should be. That we're creating an environment where all the kids feel like they're being serviced, no matter what their needs are. So I definitely appreciate that. Julie, what do you think?
Yeah, I'd like to get into what does that look like in a little bit more detail. Like, are there different ways of including everybody? What kind of models are out there? Maybe you can talk to your personal experience about what you've seen in schools. I know you work in a district office, so the schools that you support, what's working?
Yeah, so I would say, inclusion should be fluid in my mind, right? So students should be able to spend time, or should be spending time in the general ed classroom. They should be accessing the curriculum. They should be being provided with their accommodations and their modifications. Then we have to also recognize that, the reason a student is identified as a student with disabilities, that, there is a gap there is something that's possibly getting in the way of their learning. So we have to also provide that time for them to have that targeted, specific, individualized instruction. And that may or may not be within the general education classroom, because that might not be the right place for them to learn that particular skill. So that might be in a resource room. But I would say, ideally, students, will be gaining their skills through their specialized instruction. And the more that they gain those skills, then the less time that they should have to be pulled out of that gen ed classroom, because they're gaining those skills, they're becoming more confident, they're becoming more proficient, and then they could spend more time in the gen ed classroom. So the goal should always be, as a teacher, is how do I keep the student, or how do I help the student develop skills so that they can access that general education curriculum with the appropriate modifications and accommodations. So I think if we keep that mindset, then that's how we could and should look at the continuum. There's many different models. I mean, I know of 5 that we typically use here in our district. One is the consult model, where the special education teacher is really doing indirect service to the special ed student, but more direct service to the teacher, really just providing support to the teacher. How would a modification look? What would an accommodation look like? There's what Janine just referred to as the co-teaching model, where, both teachers, ideally, the special education teacher and the gen ed teacher, are sharing responsibility for the students. There's the pull-out model, which is where, if I believe if it's done really well, then it's done where that targeted instruction is being provided, with the idea of having the students spend more and more time in the gen ed setting. Then there's also the paraprofessional support, where somebody is going into a classroom to support a student or a group of students within that classroom. And we'll talk about that in a little bit, but and then there's the self-contained model, where, obviously that is not inclusion, that's full exclusion. But there's, in each of the models, I believe there's pros and cons. And I don't know if you want me to speak about what I see in my district, I can certainly speak to that. Is that what you look? Okay. So in our consult model, I don't feel that that's a very good model in our district. I don't feel that we don't seem that the gen ed teachers don't feel as confident just getting the information from the special education teacher. They need to build a bigger knowledge bank. And so when the special ed teacher is doing that consult, they don't feel as though they have enough tools in their toolbox to actually work with the student themselves. So that model doesn't seem to help our students very, very well. Our co-teaching model is relatively new. We've started that just in the last couple of years. That model is definitely a model that is working better in our district because as Janine referred, we have the two teachers also working together, and we're really promoting that shared responsibility for all students. So that is definitely where we're seeing our bigger gains with the two teachers in the classroom. Our resource room model is the reason that model is the reason we had to go to the co-teaching model, because our resource room model, we were having an over reliance on it. So we were pulling our students so much from their gen ed classroom that was becoming their primary placement. And so there we were denying them that access to their gen ed curriculum. And what we were seeing in our district is that our students' achievement was actually going down. The more they were being pulled from their gen ed classroom, the more their achievement was going down. So that's not a model that is really working in our district. Unfortunately, it's a model we still have in our district, but it's something that we're trying to move away from. The paraprofessional model is another model that we tend to have an over reliance on in our district, and that's because so often, again, I believe it comes to confidence, the confidence of the the teacher, the gen ed teacher in the classroom, and also the special ed teacher not wanting their student to fail. So they want to put somebody with the student when the student goes into the inclusive environment. But what we find there is that the gen ed teacher spends less time working with the actual student, because I think the mindset must be, okay, well, they have that person, so that person will help them, and then I can go help this student over here. So what happens is the special ed student, while they're in the classroom, they're actually not getting that time with their teacher. So that model seems, the more we rely on that model, the less time our students are actually getting to spend with their classroom teacher. And then we do have a self-contained model in our schools as well. And that is just for our students that they really just need that space away. And what we try very hard is not to make that a permanent placement for them, but more of a safe place for them to go until they feel that they are ready to come back into the gen ed setting. And most of our students in our self-contained settings are have a lot of behavioral dysregulation, and that's the reason that they actually use that model a little bit.
Yeah, I think some of it has to do with physical space that you're talking about. And so that's like just a very basic definition of inclusion. If the kid's down the hall, he's not included in the regular classroom, and that can be, isolating experience. It's stigmatizing, certainly. I'm always amazed sometimes when I tour schools where there will be an actual sign like resource room, special education, speech therapy center, whatever it is. It's like, who wants to walk through that door in, a high school or middle school or, whatever, any school. But I'm always amazed by like the labels that we put on some of these spaces. And I guess for me, an ideal situation would be if there is a pull-out place, that would be a shared space that everybody would use that space at one point or another. And it could be for, a special project or an extension activity, and, for some extra help if that is required. So to me, it's about the physical space as well. I don't know if you have, that same thought or.
Well, I agree. And you say that, and I can visualize every single school in our district that has the labels of, resource room, speech, OT, PT. So, I mean, we all do it. We all do it.
Yeah, we have these spaces, and I guess it's not so much about, pulling a kid aside to work on, articulation goals or something that needs to be done away from the general population. Certainly that's going to happen in schools, but I just have a visceral reaction to those actual spaces. Like it could be just turn it a little bit, uh, and those spaces don't need to be exclusively for speech or for whatever or OT or something like that, because I don't think adults spend enough time thinking, what does it feel like to walk through that door? And what are you taking on about your own identity as you do that? So I just think there could be a total shift in how we design the physical school building. That's that's what I think.
I like what you're saying too, Julie. And Patti, I'm wondering if there's any schools in your district that are doing any sort of reimagining of space to make things feel more inclusive. Do you know of any of examples of that?
Not space, but I will say what one of the movements that we've had is we've stopped saying that students have to be served by only special educators. So we are like, what one of the campaigns that we've started is that the students with the most needs need to be served by the teacher with the most knowledge. So a lot of our reading consultants right now are working with our students with disabilities and our not students that don't have disabilities when they have characteristics of dyslexia. So we've really started to make a little bit of that shift. So it's similar to what Julie's saying, is like, other people can access space. We're starting to say other people can access the resources, which I think is a good movement.
And Patti, you make another good point. It is true that in certain circumstances that students with probably the most needs in the building may be paired with people who have the least experience. Not that they're not valued, but I've seen that exact thing where paraprofessionals, people who do not have education background or something like that, and the teacher thinks you're exactly right what you said. All right, well, that kid's getting some attention. But that wasn't the intent of that person being in the room. Exactly. So I like this idea of this co-teaching model. I think one of the hindrances is that's expensive. um, what what other kind of problems do you see? Like, what is not working out there? What kinds of things, if you had a magic wand, would you fix?
Oh, resources, definitely. If I had a magic wand, I'd make all classes co-teaching classes. I also feel like the way we look at certifications, the way we look at teacher certifications, because our teachers go through the certification process and they're specializing in, if you're at the middle school on up, you're specializing in math, you're specializing in English, specializing in science, or if you're at the elementary, you're going to be a K2 teacher or an intermediate school teacher. But we're not asking every teacher to be a special education teacher. And I feel like if we were to really consider, if we're going to ask people to be inclusive, we're going to ask teachers to teach all the students, which they must, right? These are all these school buildings and these schools belong to all students. And we should be training our teachers to teach all students. And I don't feel that we're doing a good enough job at that right now, because I feel like we keep ourselves in silos, right? We have a special ed silo, we have a gen ed silo. So we need to pull everybody back. And if we could come down with one certification, when you become a teacher, you have both. You know how to teach English, but you also know how to accommodate and modify for a student who's going to require that. I think that goes back to the knowledge bank. Then we're going to have more confidence with our teachers and our students. They're going to feel like they know that student because they know how to teach that student. And I think that we're kind of missing the boat a little bit on that right now with our certification process.
Yeah, and I think even if you don't have that special ed degree, changing the mindset sometimes in the building where, whether or not this is your background, special education, this is your kid, this is your responsibility. And that's a shift that needs to happen in a lot of buildings.
It's interesting that we're talking about teacher preparation here. I think we could probably spend an entire episode or series or anything in great length to talk about teacher preparation programs. And Matt, Julie, and Janine, maybe that's another series down the line. But what I want to point out and talk about here just for a minute, if we could, is the IEP. And this is a commonly used document to serve special education students. And I've had many hot arguments with teachers and other folks about IEPs. And Patti, I want to hear your take on IEPs. So, individual education plan, legal binding document, entered into under great scrutiny with special education teacher, general education teacher, parent, potentially lawyers or mediators in some situations. Do you have any sort of initial reactions or gut reactions or any sort of hot takes on IEPs that you can share that before we get into the meat and potatoes of an IEP a bit?
Sure. An IEP, it's a legal document. It needs to be followed. It needs to be created with a team. Should be a team effort. I don't think they're well understood. I think parents especially don't necessarily look at the grid all the time and understand how much time their student is getting both in and outside of their general education classroom. The grid is not always as easily read as one would expect. And I think that what's important is that some people look at the IEP and they think that's the kid's whole education. And it's not. That is the specialized instruction that should go hand in hand with the regular education that's going on. And I think that that's the missing point, is that people think, oh, that's the kid's IEP. That's what it has to be. That's what we're legally bound to take care of. But that's really not. We're legally bound to educate the student. These little pieces of the student's education have to be presented in a different way, but we're legally bound to educate the whole student.
Right. So what you're saying is an IEP is just part of the education plan that a student really should be receiving from their school. And in isolation, the IEP is not, I would venture to say, and correct me if I'm wrong here, but in isolation, the IEP is not super helpful and should be viewed in conjunction with the general education, hit points for the student as well. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely. Absolutely. If you look at a student's IEP goals and they're going to learn these 10 vocabulary words, is that all you want your student to learn for the whole year? I mean, I would imagine you want your student to learn to read.
Probably. Yeah, I'd hope so. Right.
So that's why that has to go hand in hand.
Right. So I got into a Twitter argument the other day with an educator, which is a fun thing to do if you've never done it. And I was saying that I believe that the IEP as a document should be used more frequently for students because individualized education approaches for more students is actually a better way to go for more students. And I would love to hear, as someone who comes, such as yourself, who comes primarily from the special education world, and I don't, what your feelings are about that. Should there be more IEPs in the world? Should we use the IEP process as a way to leverage more specific and high quality, potentially, instruction for more students? I'd love to hear your thoughts.
I think that's I don't know. I think, I mean,
I'm not throwing softballs on this one.
So do I believe in individualized learning plans? Yes. Do I think that we should make sure that we're looking at each student individually and coming up with a plan for what they need to learn in order to get where they need to go? Absolutely. So an IEP is targeting those specific gaps. So an individualized learning plan would target the specific gaps. I guess I'm talking myself into this. But I would want it to be robust enough, because again, I think we still fall into the trap then if we have an individualized learning plan and we're only targeting, goals and objectives and if you're familiar with IEP, right? You can't put everything into the IEP. you're going to pick and choose those areas that need to be addressed, those gaps, then we will miss, again, that bigger picture of the entire education process for that student. I would think I would probably want to see more of a progression, like a learning progression plan, so that we could maybe, work with the student from A and get the student to the end zone, where we're having those constant conversations with the student and with the family about what the student wants to learn and what the student needs to learn. I would just not want to limit it to these goals and objectives, and then we've done our job, because I don't think we can rest on that.
Yeah, sure. I think I see what you're saying, that you feel like the IEP as a document can be a limiting factor for students when we're really trying to service the entirety of the student in a holistic way. And if we're relying on the IEP too much, then that IEP can be a little bit of pigeonholing the student's educational experience. And I can see that argument. I'm still on the fence about whether or not I think IEPs should be for more students. And, maybe we can address that over in the think tank. But I'm going to pass the mic off to Matt, because I think Matt's got some solid questions here queued up for you too, Patti.
Hey, Patty, as we think about, an inclusive environment and the difficult aspects of that, and as educators, we have one side that's fighting to make it more inclusive, and the other side is sort of scared of, what that can all mean for them, for their job. I got to do this, I got to do that. And sometimes what gets lost in the midst of that is sort of the culture of the school. And so that's what this question sort of gets to. How do we create a school culture that ensures all students are included?
Oh, it really starts with vision, and it really, being a school leader and having been a building leader as well, a lot of it does fall at the onset with the leadership. So it starts with, the leadership of the district, the leadership of the building leaders. There needs to be that bias. We need the bias for social justice. We have to value equity. We have to honor the right for equal education opportunities. Okay, like when we think about, where did IDA come from, right? The law for special education. It came from civil rights. It was separate's not equal. Okay, so like we needed to stop taking our students with disabilities and not allowing them into our schools. And we needed to say, no, it's not our schools, it's your school. So we need to get back to that, right? We need to get to that social justice place again. We need to say, hey, this is a human rights issue, that these students are part of this entire community. And as a district leader and as a building leader, we need to honor that. We need leaderships that just have that philosophy, that value inclusion, feel that responsibility for all learners. So, we talk about co-teaching, right? And we say with co-teaching, we need both teachers to feel responsible for the learners, but we need our building and our district leaders to feel this similarly. They need to feel that, okay, this is everybody's school, and we want every student to do well, not just our students that came without a disability, our students that struggle more. We need to find ways to help them do well as well. And we just need those positive attitudes. We need to have our leaders, really value FAPE, free and appropriate public education, and really value the least restrictive environment. Not look at it as this is a burden on me, but look at it as, this is what I have to do because this is what's right. So that's it. Really does start with the building leadership, but then after that, we have to have the shared decision making. We have to have collaboration. We need to educate people. Everybody. They go to school. The teachers go to school. They learn about IDA as part of special ed, as part of everybody's training, but they need to learn more about what a least restrictive environment is and why inclusion is important. They need to know about the benefits and the social benefits and the academic benefits of it, because once they learn that, then they can understand why it's so important. It's very easy to think that a student is being serviced over in the special ed department, or as Julie would say, down the hallway, without realizing that when they're actually in the class, that the students most likely will do better academically. So it just really starts with, having that bias for social justice and having that philosophy towards inclusion, and then just building on it from there.
Yeah, I appreciate the way that you're elevating the leadership role and the things that they're going to focus on. What have you seen and you've talked about them already, but just sort of trying to get super practical for some, school leaders that are listening and they're thinking, okay, how can I get started? What are some good first steps? What are some things that I can do in my school to make sure it's an inclusive environment for all students? What are some of the biggest practical things that school leaders could do tomorrow to make sure that it's an inclusive environment for all
I'd say
students?
the first thing is they need to become educated. They need to themselves have some professional development about inclusion and about least restrictive environments, about academic and social benefits, and then they need to train their staff in those same things. They need to really share with their faculty the why. Why are we doing this? And they need to work with their faculty to understand that. They need to provide opportunities for their faculty to offer explicit instruction, but they also need to provide opportunities for the faculties to collaborate with each other. So it's not just that, special education teacher is going to be doing this explicit instruction, but after they do that explicit instruction with the special education student, they need to provide that collaboration time so that the special education teacher and the general education teacher can work together, so that then the general education teacher can take on some of that explicit instruction as well. So it's really just the building leaders need to model, I would say, for their faculty, what that collaboration is going to look like, really be very, very proactive about providing those opportunities for professional development, and just start building that culture of, everybody belongs here. That would be where I would, say to start. That's kind of what we're trying to do in our district a little bit. We've been, we started with professional development, when we started with an explicit instruction for our special educators. But then what we're doing now is we're pushing out our explicit instruction to our general education teachers. So like what we're teaching our special education teachers, we're now also teaching our general education teachers. And if you think about a typical school system, it's usually the other way around. Usually your professional development is attacking what's going on in the general education side, and your special education teachers are just learning, okay, what do I have to do to modify and accommodate? We're starting to do it the other way around, where we're starting to attack some of that special education issues and then teach it to the gen ed side, so that this way everybody's getting that same knowledge bank, and hopefully building that same level of confidence.
Yeah, that why piece to me is pretty powerful, and I think that's missing in sort of all parts of education, leaving space for the why. We're just sort of jamming things down people's throats, and we're just going to keep it moving. With that why, thinking about that, especially with an inclusive environment, how have you seen that done well, where people are brought together and they're able to explore the why of this happening or the why of this being important? How have you seen that done well? Because oftentimes that's skipped within an inclusive environment and really in sort of teaching pedagogy in general.
Yeah, I can't say that I've seen it well yet, honestly. It's what we're trying now in our district. And as I mentioned, we're just starting with the co-teaching model. We're only in year 2 of co-teaching. So it's relatively new for us. What we're doing, one of the things we're doing is we are highlighting our data. we're getting really good data right now out of our co-teaching model. So we're, making sure that we're doing this right now, and it's in our middle school primarily, and we're making sure that everybody in the middle school understands the progress that the students are making, and it's all students. It's not just students with disabilities, because this way we're trying to show that community that this is working for all students, and that's a really good thing.
Yeah, another thing I've been thinking about in this conversation, as I've been sitting back listening, I've sort of reflected upon, my interaction with inclusive environments, with special education students, with IEPs, and in education, and I could be wrong, I'm just throwing it out there. I'd like to hear your feedback on this. There seems to be this tension between a general education teacher and the special education teacher, and the special education student oftentimes is in the middle of this tension, because the general education teacher is sort of fighting against not wanting to do more work. The special education teacher is advocating for the student, and the student's in the middle. I guess my question to you is, why do you think this happens so much, and have you seen any sort of solutions to this?
I definitely see that. And I think, again, a lot of it I do think comes to confidence, and it comes to building that knowledge bank. I believe you're right, is that, the general education teacher doesn't, we'll say doesn't want to do more. I don't know if it doesn't want to do more. I do think because they want to be really good teachers and they want to help students. So then you have a student in front of you that, you don't feel very comfortable with, because you're not really sure how you're going to help them learn. And that's a scary thing for you, right? Because you're saying, okay, now what am I going to do? How am I going to help this student? I don't know what I'm doing. Then it's very easy then to kind of throw your hands up and say, well, this is a special education student, so this is so-and-so's. This is no longer my responsibility. This is so-and-so's responsibility. And then you have the special education teacher who, is doing their best with the student. They want their student in the inclusive environment because, they're thinking that that's, where they ought to go. And they're listening to Patti Hess, who's telling them that that's the right place for the student. And then what they're getting is they're hitting a little bit of that wall, because now their colleague is saying to them, hold on, I don't know what to do. Why are you putting this kid in my room? Blah, blah. So then they get defensive, because, special education teachers tend to, embrace and throw their arms around their students, and they become theirs for the duration. So then they're like, they get a little of that, mama bear back arched. And then now they don't want their kid in that classroom because that teacher is not going to do a good job with their kid. So we see that often. So that goes back to why I am really embracing the co-teaching model, because that is both teachers sharing the students and sharing that responsibility for the students. So that way, those students, all the students, whether they're students that are identified or students that are not identified in that class, are each teacher's students. So I think that when you can get to that place, then you're not having those conversations. Then you're having conversations about, how do I help this student, or how do I help that student? And it doesn't have to be a student with an identified disability. You're just helping the student in front of you.
Patti, you've raised so many really important points here. I think there's so much to think about in this episode, and I really appreciate you bringing all of this to the fore and really promoting this idea of inclusive education as a way to think about education in general. Hey everyone, this is Mike. Thanks so much for joining us for our third episode in our mini-series on equity, belonging, and inclusion. And we hope that you've loved this conversation with Dr. Patti Hess, one of our colleagues from Northeastern University. As you might have heard in our last episode, we just launched a brand new series. It's called Pod Stories EDU. You can find it wherever you find your podcasts, and it is a micro podcast. So all the episodes are under 15 minutes, and it is amplifying student voice. Be sure to check out Pod Stories EDU wherever you get your podcasts. Share that with your friends. And also hop on over to our Patreon page at patreon.com/rethinkingedu. We've got a bunch of really awesome think tank episodes up for you to listen to. We promise you won't be sorry for supporting us at the $3 a month level. Finally, don't forget to check out our very own Matt Downing's podcast, Diving Deep EDU. Thanks.
A quick interruption to let you know about another great podcast.
Curious conversations with all types of peeps. Encouraging innovation, we are diving deep. Certainly education is what we like to speak. Fervent with dedication, now it is time to teach.
Diving Deep EDU. Thought-provoking conversations.
Now, every episode of Rethinking EDU, we always kind of wrap up the conversation with a reflection time, a time for us to, name some of the things that we've been thinking about throughout hearing each other go back and forth. And I would love to hear, co-hosts, what you all have been thinking about. Janine, why don't you go first?
Oh man, there's so much here to unpack, actually.
That's why I picked you first. You're usually good on your feet.
I know. Well,
pick something.
I gotta be honest. So this brings back a whole lot of feels for me. I had a brother who was disabled. He had muscular dystrophy. We were kids. I mean, actually, this was one of the reasons why I started to pursue a doctorate and stuff like that, just because I wanted things to change in the school system. But anyway, our schooling experiences were completely different in that he could not go to the same school as me. He had to go to a school it actually was like an hour bus ride away. He rode on a separate bus, went to a separate school where they could service kids with special needs, which
interesting.
Yeah, which meant that he didn't get to go to school with our neighborhood kids. He didn't really have the opportunity to connect and make friends with them. He got home later than everybody else, and all this other stuff. And finally, in high school, though, we were able to go to the same school, and that was an eye-opening experience for me. And this is really why I ended up getting into education. I saw him sitting in that room down the hall, and just with other kids that had disabilities, and they were never mixed in with the other kids for the most part. And he's in there doing like coloring, and I remember one day I just walked into that classroom and I was like, what are you doing? Like, you shouldn't be just doing coloring pages. There's other things that you can be. I was so upset. And and then just other times, like seeing him at the lunch table sitting all alone and not having any friends, and like the system failed him because he didn't have any friends because he didn't go to the same school as them and stuff, just anyway. So this whole conversation is really making me think about my brother and just how hopeful I am and so blessed I am to actually be in the school where I'm at, where inclusion is a focal point. And when we say inclusion, we mean inclusion, and that we have the supports in place to pull it off. I think that's also key, is being able to, to pull off inclusion. I don't think it's easy. You can't say, like, when you just stick one teacher in a classroom and you say, oh yeah, let's do inclusion, like, that is almost, you're setting them up for failure. You have to have the proper support in place in order to be able to pull it off. And I think that's something that we do really well at the school where I'm at. And so I just think we've come a long way. When I really think back on the journey that I've had in the field of education, and when I think of that classroom down the hall with my brother in it, and here I am teaching at a fully inclusive school, I am thankful for the changes that I have seen in my lifetime as an educator.
Dang, that's deep, Janine.
Sorry, I told you it brings up like all these feels. That's why I wasn't like jumping in, because had all these thoughts coming back. But yeah, no, I really appreciate the conversation, and I appreciate Patti's just enlightenment of everything involved with special ed and inclusion. And I really wish you could come to Pennsylvania, Patti.
Julie, what about you? What's this bringing up for you?
Oh, again, I could probably talk for an hour here, but I'll keep it brief. I'm thinking about something Patti had said, and really how many good intentions are out there that just seem to, in practice. So Matt was talking about the why, like I'm thinking about the how, how we implement things, even like things that we on the surface are all about trying to include kids, like PBIS and RTI and SAP teams and all of these structures that are put in place and resource rooms and all of this stuff um, designed to support kids. Um, but what is the end result with the sorting and the labeling and really the isolation and the separating? Sometimes in practice, man, it seems like we get it wrong. Like I'm thinking about like remediation. Like I think one of the ideas I have for like an article someday is about the failed model of remediation. Like I just don't think that I've ever seen it work. Like, have you ever seen a kid, it's rare if it does happen. I can think of a couple, but where the minute the kid starts to fall, we start patching up holes, like the kid's a piece of drywall and we're putting the patchwork in there, It just doesn't seem to ever work. So thinking about instead of remediation, like turning that and getting the kid ready for the next thing, that acceleration model, um, I don't know. That's what I'm thinking about. I'm thinking about all of the things that we try to do in this desperate attempt to include people. Sometimes we get it wrong, and I just think the end result, it's limiting. It really is. And I go back to another thing that Patti said, like for regular ed teachers. I'm a regular ed teacher. This is my work. This is where I come to education, where it's not just clean up in aisle 9. This is my student too. So I think that whole dynamic between the regular ed special ed teacher, that just has to change.
Matt, what about you?
Yeah, I think providing extensive time of training to all staff, not just the special education staff, but all staff, and then providing space and time for them to discuss and come to that why, I think is really powerful. Even, I find either, information is just given to special ed teachers or it's just given to general education teachers. It's done too quickly, and then there's no time for discussion. There's no time to process it. There's no time to reflect. There's no time to discuss. There's no time to collaborate and come together as a team. And then they want these two different teachers to work as a team, but there's no time for that. So yeah, that's one of the many things that have been really helpful.
Yeah, I think for me, I'm still kind of mulling over whether I think the IEP is a good idea for every student. In some cases, I think that the legally binding nature of the IEP is important because sometimes schools just leave kids behind and there's no kind of ramification for that. And I think particularly for students of color who are from under-resourced communities, who are from families who need to work 2 and 3 jobs in order to pay rent, to keep food on the table, those kids are the ones that are getting left behind more than the other kids. And those kids are the ones that need more people looking out for them when it comes to their educational processes. And yet there's no mechanism there in place for looking after those kids. So does that mean that we should use the IEP as a tool to make sure that these kids are really getting what they need? And I don't know that I have the right answer to that question. I think the IEP, as Patti has pointed out, can be a limiting document in and of itself. And it also can be a document that requires a whole lot of resources from schools and a process that requires a whole lot of resources from schools. And schools don't have a whole lot of resources. And so I'm wondering, whether or not it's an equitable approach to dump more resources into constructing an IEP for students when those resources could be used for other things at already resource depleted schools. So I have lots of questions around that, and I look forward to hashing that all out in the think tank with you all. But before we go there, Patti, what are your reflections on this conversation?
My head is spinning because this is obviously my work. This is my passion, and this is my struggle every single day. So for me, Matt asked, the why, and for me, this is my why. This is I said at the onset, 30 years I've been trying to remove obstacles for students with disabilities, and I feel like not being included is a huge obstacle. So, so you guys just really stirred me. You got me all stirred up. I don't think I'm going to bed tonight. So, for me, it's just the work is worth it. We have to continue. We have to pave the way for these students. It's all about morality at this point. We really have to make sure that we're doing right for all students. And I agree with you, Mike. We do leave students behind, and we have to address how we leave them behind. But that's all students. So I say this at my work all the time is, we have to be responsive to all students in our classrooms. Just if we look at every single student and say, you were mine, I'm here for you. That right there is a way to start looking at that. But once we start putting kids in silos, and once we start sorting them and saying, oh, you're here, you're there, that's when we lose it, because now we don't own that whole student. So for me, it's about all students, and it's about ownership.
Right on. Yeah, Patti, I so appreciate your insights here. And we always end our episodes with a segment called Plugs, where we offer our guest and our co-hosts time to plug something. Co-hosts, guess what? I brought a plug this week. Aren't y'all excited? You want to hear about my plug. Well, my plug this week is this 3D rendering tool that I've been playing around with. It allows you to create 3D home sketches, and provides a whole lot of just sort of like interior decoration and design tools, and it's totally for free. It's called Home by Me, and you can go to home.by.me and sign up for an account. I've created 2 really kind of fun 3D renderings of homes that I would love to build one day for myself or for all my friends or whomever. And so that's kind of what I want to plug. It's super fun. You can definitely get kids engaged in the process of home design and dimension. Patti, let's give you a chance to plug something that you're reading, or something you're listening to, or something you'd like to share with our audience.
I don't have a plug as much as I just have a shout out. And I just want to say to anybody who's listening, if you're working on behalf of students with disabilities and desperately trying to change the culture in your school and to create a more inclusive culture, then I just want to shout out to you, because you're making a difference. The work is hard, but the work is worth it. So just thank you.
So I think what you're saying is you want to plug all teachers out there that are working to be inclusive in their efforts.
I call them inclusion champions.
I love it. Patti, if you could just buy up the domain inclusionchampions.com, and we will, put a basic website out there, click on inclusionchampions.com and get a free donut sent to your school or something like that. I would love it. Well, Dr. Patti Hess, it's been a pleasure here on our podcast. We've loved chatting with you. Listeners, thank you for joining us. We hope that you've taken something really great away from this conversation with Patti and our last 2 conversations in our mini series on equity, belonging, and inclusion. We know that these episodes have been super nourishing for us as a co-host team and for our guests, and we hope that they've been nourishing for you. We hope that you also will continue to support our podcast at patreon.com/rethinkingedu, and you get access to our think tank for $3 a month. Super cheap, super worth it. Listeners, we love you, we appreciate you, and keep rethinking EDU.